Hey, it's Daniel, and today I'm going to go over the term Wicca and authentic Wicca and stuff like that. So I want to make a disclaimer. This is my opinion, and just my opinion. If you disagree, that's fine. Please, no hateful comments. And one, I don't tend to use the term Wiccan to label myself anymore. I prefer the term witch. But I'm going to go over basically how the term Wicca kind of became an umbrella term and how it was originally intended and how it's used now. Just kind of go over that a little bit. Like I said, this is just based on the research I've done, and if I'm wrong, feel free to correct me, but I have studied it, and I do want to make, before I begin, I do make a distinction between traditional Wicca, which is Gardnerian Alexandrian practice, and eclectic Wicca, sometimes called Neo-Wicca or Pop Wicca or the Wicca you learn from books. They are different, and I think anyone who doesn't recognize that they're different really needs to do some research. They are different. Now they have similarities. Eclectic Wicca or the Wicca you find books, in my opinion, is an outgrowth of traditional Wicca. So whether you agree with it or not, we wouldn't have that without traditional practitioners who publish books and articles and actually begin to apply the term Wicca to non-initiatory practices. So that's my opinion. I think one of the first books people who began to open Wicca up using the label was probably Ramon Buckland. He published The Tree, the complete book of Saxon witchcraft, which he used Wicca with one C, just like Gerald Gardner did the original, although I prefer to keep that for initiates only. For those who are Alexandrian Gardnerians, the Wicca, that's what Gerald Gardner called it, or the witch court, I think that was his preferred term, the witch cult. And so if you're not one of the initiates of Gardnerian, you're not one of the Wicca, W-I-C-A. That is a very specific term only used for initiates. I would make that clear, just so I don't have to repeat myself. That's a very separate thing, and that's not what I'm talking about. The next few people to kind of open up Wicca to the general public was Stuart and Janet Farrar, who were initiates of Alexander's. They wrote a book which later was combined, two different books. Well, they wrote many books, but two books. One was in 1981, the other one was 1984, that was later combined into the Witch's Bible, a complete Witch's Handbook, Stuart and Janet Farrar. This book, again, actually, in the end of it, it actually gives a self-initiation ritual. Again, I don't like the term self-initiation because you can't really initiate yourself into something that you never were initiated to begin with. It takes a person to do that. Now, I'm not saying you're not a authentic Wiccan. Please don't misuse my words. I just prefer the term self-dedication. It's one reason I do like Scott Cunningham, because he's probably one of the first people I saw who used the term self-dedication. Because you're dedicating yourself to something opposed to trying to initiate into something. Although in his later book, A Further Guide, Living Wicca, Further Guide, he does go and use the term self-initiation, which I personally, again, don't like that term, because I don't think you can initiate yourself into something. That's just my opinion. The next major book that was also written by an initiate, which was Ramon Buckland's Complete Book of Witchcraft, or Big Blue. I think that was published in 1986, I believe. Now again, he did use witchcraft on the front, but if you read it, it does apply the term Wicca to the religion of witches. Again, Wicca is one form of witchcraft, not the only form. But again, he's kind of the one who kind of, if it wasn't for Ramon Buckland, we wouldn't have got the generalized term of Wicca for non-initiatory practices, and that's just my opinion. Now, the person who probably really kind of pushed it over the edge, kind of popularized it, was Scott Cunningham, in my opinion. I think he published his first book, Wicca Guide for Self, in 1980, I think it was 1988 to 89. That's this book. Now, I want to actually read from this book from the preface. I think people would skip this preface. Mispronounced that, but you know what I mean. Because first off, I think if you bother to read this, he does actually state that this is a new form of Wicca. It is not traditional Wicca. I think a lot of people just skip over this and don't read this. Actually, I'll read it to you. It says, Wicca, as described here, is new. It is not a revelation of ancient rituals handed down for 1,000 years. This does not invalidate it, However, it is based on time-honored practices. I don't know if he was initiated of any recognized tradition. I don't know. I haven't. But he makes it very clear that the Wicca you find in this book is a new form of Wicca. Actually, he didn't use the term Neo-Wicca, but he probably could have very well used that term, even though I don't really like the term Neo-Wicca, because I find that it's used mostly, whether they people in a derogatory way, even if it's not intended that way. I think most of the time when I see it online it is used. And I also want to read in his second book in the series, which was Living Wicca Guide a further guide for the solitary practitioner, which I think was published in the early 90s, if I'm correct, and I could be wrong. He actually has a note for traditional Wiccans in there, explaining that this book is not, he's not trying to insult the form of Wicca. It's simply a new form, and ask people to read it with open mind. So if you read that, he does make it very clear that what he's doing is new. So I want to make, and so I think he's kind of the one who his book kind of pushed the envelope to kind of help expand the term Wicca into the umbrella term that we see today. A lot of people think it's probably overly used, and I probably agree with them. I've been guilty of that myself. But for me personally, I do actually support the umbrella term of Wicca. One, the original people that even if they didn't do it intentionally, to begin to use that term for non-traditional Wiccans or initiates. And whether we can't really argue that point. I mean, Stuart and Janet and Stuart Farrar were Alexander initiates. Roman Buckland was the Gardnerian initiate. He was initiated in the presence of Gerald Gardner by his high priestess, and he's actually the one who brought Gardnerian Wicca to the United States. Whether we can disagree with his opinion, we can say that it's not, but he kind of the one who, they were kind of the big people that kind of helped move it into that definition. And now there's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of books with Wicca on the cover that are not written by non-initiates. Some of them are probably second and third generations. They will learn by books and learn by books and learn by books, not initiates. But the original books that begin to open the practice up were written by initiates. Again, a lot of people disagreed with them at the time, and they disagree with them today. But what I want to kind of go over is words do change over time, and we do see that in modern Wicca. We see how originally the term Wicca was applied only to initiatory traditions, and over time, which really not that long a time, probably the last 15, 20, maybe even 30 years, that term has been applied to any practices that were based on the outer court material of Gardnerian and Alexander Wicca. I say outer court because it's just the material that was either leaked to the public that shouldn't have been leaked, or books that were written by initiates that kind of gave their own spin on things. That's kind of what got its start. So I think we have to recognize that. But I think it's unfair to ask everyone to quit calling themselves Wiccan just because they're not initiates. And this is why I'm going to say this. One, the vast majority of people who call themselves Wiccans are non-initiates in the sense that they've never been initiated into a lineage tradition back to Gerald Gardner. Now, there are new Wiccan traditions that have lineages that are non-Gardnerian. But many people would say they should probably be called Neo-Pagan witchcraft, and I'm not disagreeing with them. But the fact of the matter is, you have traditions that got started in the United States in the 70s and 80s, and early 90s, that have third and fourth generation initiates who've always called the tradition Wicca. And if they would have to rewrite their entire tradition to accommodate not using that term, and the simple fact is it has grown, and that's part of what they are now, whether you agree with the term or not. I have friends who, I hate to use the term grandmother stories, who the grandmother really was Wiccan. Now, what I mean by this is they adopted they used books in the early 80s, 70s and 80s. They began to read books by witches. They crafted, what some people call them bootstrap traditions. They crafted traditions, and then they taught their children, and their children taught their children, and now they're coming on fourth generations where the little kids are being, normally they wait till they're older to let them choose the tradition, and these people have always used Wicca. To tell someone who was raised, and I have friends who were raised Wiccan. They weren't raised into initiatory Wicca, but I have friends who are literally third generations. Who I went to high school with a girl And I knew her mother and her grandmother. Now, her grandmother was honest and very much think that she invented her tradition. She read books, and she's passed away now, and actually the person who I knew, her mother, has also passed away, and they use the term Wicca. And now she's using it, and then now her children, who are actually now 18 and 19, are being initiated into her brand of Wicca. And like I said, that's part of the family line. Whether we agree with the term or the definition of the term, it's become open, and there's really nothing we can do about it. I mean, I've been told that people who call themselves Wiccan who don't have a direct Gardnerian Alexandrian are just fooling themselves, and maybe that is so, but I think that when we really start to think about it, Wicca, the authenticity of a Wiccan tradition is not in my opinion, in so much in the rituals and stuff that they use, but in the practitioners. It may not be authentic traditional Wicca, but it certainly is authentic Wicca to them. So whether you agree with it or disagree with it, and you may have more things in common with them or less things in common with them, but to say that they're not Wiccan, I think is really saying, whether you want to, it's really saying, I don't know how to put this without being rude, is basically saying their path isn't valid, even if you don't necessarily mean it that way. Because I know a lot of traditional Wiccans, when they say you're not Wiccan, they're not meaning it in a derogatory way. What they're really saying is you're not initiatory Wiccan. You're not part of the traditional form of Wicca. And I think we have to recognize that what we call Wicca and what they call Wicca are two separate things. If you're not initiated, you don't know what that is, because it is an oath-bound tradition. So unless you're initiated, you're not going to know what that is. I'm not an initiate of those traditions, so I know nothing about what the inner core rituals are like. And like I said, from what I've been told, it's vastly different from what we read in the books. And that's okay, because it's different, Just because something is new doesn't mean it's not authentic. Doesn't mean that it's not spiritually valuable to the person. But I do think that if we say that something is not really authentic just because we don't like what it means, that we'll get ourselves in muddy waters. Now I agree with you. Some people's argument is, I can call myself a Catholic priest all I want, but unless I've gone through the proper training, I'm not a Catholic priest, and I get that. But unfortunately, words have meaning over time, and the term Wicca has become an umbrella term for a loose-based form of religious Neo-Pagan witchcraft. Whether we like that term or not, that's the term that has been applied. I think a lot of it had to do with at least in the United States, during the 80s and early 90s with the Satanic Panic. Well, people were trying to distance themselves from that because literally they were losing kids and their family. I mean, I think Doreen Variante put it best when she said witchcraft doesn't pay for broken windows, and I have to agree. And the term Wicca was just easier, and I think a lot of witches, people who probably would have originally preferred witch, began to adopt the term Wicca, and that was passed on, and then they began to publish books, and whether we want to acknowledge it or not, that is valid now. And here's the thing is, people say, well, you can't become a Catholic, you can't become a Roman Catholic without, but what if every Christian in the world began to publish books calling themselves Catholic and saying that they were Catholic priests? Eventually, 4 and 5 generations down the way, we'd have to acknowledge that the definition has changed. So they still wouldn't be the original pop because they have no accession, no apostolic accession to that. But we would have to say that they have a valid spiritual practice, whether we agree or disagree with the label that they're using. That's simply the fact that they are now that. It's different, it's new, it's not the same as the original, but it has become accepted. So whether we agree with a non-initiatory people using the term Wicca or not isn't really the point of the matter. The point is, it is used, and there's no way to put the cat back in the bag, so to speak. People are going to use the term Wicca. People are going to pick up a book. They're going to go to the bookstore. They're going to read 30 books where they all say Wicca on the spine. They're going to live that. Then maybe they might start a coven, initiate people, and then they might start a coven. So then you get, like I said, we've got traditions in the United States that have no lineage back to the original covens, but they have a form of religious witchcraft or religious paganism that they call Wicca and have called Wicca for 30, 40, 50, no, not 50, probably 30, 40, 10, 20 years. And that's just part of what they are now. Whether you agree with the term or not, that's kind of what it has become. So that's just kind of my take on the subject of what authentic Wicca is. And my term is there is authentic traditional Wicca, and then there's eclectic Wicca, which is authentic in its own right, but it's different. So I hope I made sense and didn't ramble on too much. But in my opinion, we have to acknowledge that there is what Scott Cunningham called a new form of Wicca, or what some people call a Neo-Wicca, even though I don't like the term Neo-Wicca. But I think it is an outgrowth of traditional Wicca, not necessarily like a sect of it. It's something that kind of grew up around it. And we have to be honest, some people will never want to go through the training process of traditional Wicca. I mean, the Wicca they learned is spiritually fulfilling and authentic to them. It may not be what it was intended, but that's what it is now. Like I said, I'd love to hear your comments. Many blessings.